Woo, woo. Well, thank you everybody for coming. It basically is a software event, so we're never expecting lots of people in the hardware event. And I do find it really funny that when I talk to all these software people, they've got absolutely no idea what sits below that makes this software work. I just find it really interesting. But the magic of bringing all the free opens together, the open source hardware, the open source software, and the open data, and I'm also a board member, by the way, on Open UK, is to try and integrate, get this depth of integration, because when you deeply integrate all those free opens, magic happens. So this is the whole idea of this event, to try and integrate. But this is the first one we've ever done, so more open source hardware people coming forward in time. How many people are into open source hardware in the room? All right. How many people are software people? Right, okay, that's nice little mix, that's good. Right, well I've got about 30 minutes. I'll just shift through this, and I'm going to talk about sustainability of data centers. And I'm going to take a broader picture on sustainability of data centers. I'm not just going to be drilling into the technology, I'm going to broaden this out into what I see as sustainability as a definition. So what is the definition of sustainability? Now these are three models that you might see, and the one I really love is the nested loops on the top right hand corner. And to put that into context, this is called the embedded economy model. And it's really the new form of economics that's coming forward from the new economists. And it's this concept that we have planet Earth with limited resource. Within that we have society, and within that we have our economy embedded. Now what's interesting, if anyone wants to read the book, this book here is a really good book, Donut Economics by Kate Raworth. Strongly recommend it. But this is the new economics where we're moving. And what's at the core of this is the commons. As you can see here, you've got the commons. Now this is an open collaborative commons, which is an essential kind of ingredient at the core of this new economic model. So for me, open source and open source tech and the collaborative commons is just a lot more than technology. It has a much broader horizon. Now let's just look at a few things, looking at the broader aspects of sustainability, looking at some of the social issues. This was a documentary that was on Monday night, and it was about how bad data centers are in terms of water and energy. This here is from a few years ago. I did a conference in Dublin, and as you probably all know, do you know this little, see that little symbol there? See that little flag there with a kind of this, looks like a circle that lady and that man are holding? Yeah, got the circle and then there's a crossing. How many people know what that symbol is? Okay, that's great. Extinction Rebellion. And it signifies time's running out. It's basically like a sandglass. Now what's interesting, they demonstrated at this conference, this data center conference, there was over 1,000 people at the conference. And they very cleverly came in, they sabotaged the fire alarms, and there was a mass evacuation. And so everybody left the building. And I was really pleased they did something. And the reason it's happening in Ireland, these demonstrations, is Ireland is suffering from the impacts of data centers in a big way. Really, it is becoming an issue. And I thought, let me go and talk to these people. So they were all standing outside on the street behind these big railings. So I went out, we were all standing on the grass, and I just went outside and I said, well, tell me about what your issues are. And they told me what their issues were. And then I went back inside after an hour when we all were let back in. And I started walking around to the people on the inside. And I started asking, what was that demonstration about? And they were telling me one view. And I'm After 20 minutes talking to these people on the outside, I'm getting a totally different picture. And what I realised is a total disconnect. In the data center industry, it's a very inward-looking kind of picture. It's a groupthink mindset that exists within the industry. And there is very little idea of the impacts externally and what people think about them internally. So this is really fundamental, because what I'm going to basically say is the idea of sustainability to someone inside the data center industry is not that big embedded economy model. It's very much an insular, inward-looking thing. Society don't exist within this. And it's going to be a big surprise to them as these demonstrations develop. Things are going to really hit them hard. So you should be prepared for this external threat. You can't just ignore the environment, you can't just ignore society. So that's the fundamental point I'm trying to make here. So just some of the moratoriums. Now, a moratorium is where data centers are not allowed to be built. There's been politicians have come in, policymakers said, no more data centers. And these are just a few. Singapore, got Frankfurt, Amsterdam, but there's this kind of movement that's occurring. It's the impact of these data centers. John, who's sitting over there, this is John Booth, who's really passionate on the sustainability side. If you want to know about a lot more of this, he's the man to talk to afterwards, and he will tell you so much about all the kind of the deeper political kind of shenanigans that are going on in this sense. But here's a few other things, like water usage. On that BBC documentary, that Panorama documentary, they mention water usage. Just to give you an idea, a kind of a sizable data center will use the equivalent in water every single day. And this is potable water, this is drinkable water. Equivalent to an Olympic-sized swimming pool every single day. And all they're doing is evaporating that water into the atmosphere. Every day, an Olympic-sized swimming pool. Go and have a look at the Google environmental reports. Go and have a look at Microsoft environmental reports. Look at Facebook's environment. Look at their water that they consume in a year. It is absolutely staggering. And what you've got to realise is where some of these data centres are. They're in the Arizona desert. And there's a real big water shortage. And now the policymakers are now coming in and hitting them hard, and they're going to restrict them on their water usage. So here's an example. When there was a hosepipe ban last year in the UK, we have a huge cluster of data centres in Slough. We had citizens were restricted on their water usage, but there was no water usage restrictions on the data centres. And this is what's going to start to cause the kind of the turmoil between the citizens and the industry. Now, you can do things better. Things can be done better. Now, at the moment, if we look at heat reuse from data centres, because these data centres, they generate megawatts of heat, hundreds of megawatts of heat, some of them. Now, this is just to try and get you into the idea of breaking down these silos. And something Eric mentioned yesterday, he's talking about breaking down the silos between the software people and the hardware people. But what I'm saying, you need to break down the silos between utilities. So why are we using gas to warm up water when we've got all this heat from a data center using green electricity, which we can then use to replace burning gas? So this is just a 1-minute video to give you an idea on what combined heat and compute is. And it's a technology that's really starting to fly.
Hello. In this video, I will explain about data center combined heat compute. Today exist 3 server heat transfer options. Conventional solutions are based on air heat transfer with fans. On-chip liquid take out partial heat rejection directly from the processors. And third option is full immersion liquid heat transfer without air. In air heat transfer server, fans heat up the air till 30-40 degrees, and after, air heat exchangers produce liquid with temperature 12-30 degrees. which is not warm enough for users. For that reason, we need heat pumps, which rise up the temperature of the liquid till 60-80 degrees and after deliver it to the buildings and residential areas. With liquid on-chip heat transfer in well-managed IT servers, 80% of the heat rejection can be taken out from the chips and the rest 20% by air in conventional mode. The liquid from on-chip solution with temperature 55-65 degrees can be directly used by householders. The liquid immersion solution used the servers without fans, which fully immersed in liquid, and the heat rejection from all components is transferred to users with temperatures 45-60 degrees. In conclusion, I want to deliver the message that the combined heat compute is the way for including data center in circular decarbonized economy.
Now, there's very few data centers doing this, but let's take Ireland. 17% of all electricity generated in Ireland is used on data centers today. And the problem is that the citizens are believing that when there is a kind of an over-demand on their grid, that the data centers won't be turned off. The citizen supplies will be turned off. Now, if Ireland started to use combined heat and compute, instead of using gas to warm up water, they could be using all this heat from these huge data centers in Ireland. Therefore, they can decarbonise on the gas and the electricity for warming up water. So overall, by integrating utilities, you can start to see all these benefits occurring. Now, this takes joined up thinking, and there's an organisation called the Sustainable Digital Infrastructure Alliance who are working with OCP, and this guy here, we call him David G because he's a Russian guy living in France, who's a kind of a specialist on this. But again, if you want to know more about this, then I'd recommend you go and talk to Jon afterwards for the detail, okay? So it can get quite detailed, but this is a trend that's happening. This technology trend is happening really quickly. And just in terms of electricity cost, if you give the heat back to somebody else to use, you can reduce your electricity bills by 40%. And they do this in Sweden, they do it in Stockholm. So the energy company that provides electricity to the data center buys back the heat and then discounts electricity costs by 40%. So it makes sense environmentally and economically, it makes sense. And David G has done all the numbers. This is what's special about this guy. He's worked all the numbers out. So go online, you'll see all these little 1-minute videos he's done, and it's a great education, okay? And there's his, you can link him from his website, I think Impleon it's called. But it's just what we need is education. We need to tell people about this. If you want to know detail, go and talk to Jon. Now, just another thing is about carbon emissions. Now, we touched on it yesterday, and there was a few events yesterday afternoon in this room. And what I really loved was the passion of the people talking about carbon emissions. And what really I did like was the fact that they were women. The passion on the environmental kind of side of data centers, when the women get involved, they really shout about it and they want to create change. There was also Eric there, who has a female side to him, and he was also going on about the idea of this kind of stupidity on the way we do things. So what does it look like? Now, the greenhouse gas protocol, how many people know this protocol? Right, let me quickly cover it for you. What you've got the Scope 1 emissions, greenhouse gas emissions. They're there if, for example, you run diesel generators on site as backup. So that'd be called Scope 1. Then you've got Scope 2. What Scope 2 emissions are, they're the emissions that would be associated at the power station that generates the electricity for you. So when you consume electricity on site, you're creating greenhouse gas emissions at the power station. If it's a coal power station, then there's going to be a lot of them. If it's wind farms, there's going to be a lot less. And they're called Scope 2. And then you've got Scope 3. And this is all the supply chain. This is the embodied carbon in the upstream coming in from the manufacturing, and then the downstream as you take product into the recycling side, the downstream side. Now what's interesting, what it looks like, this profile of mix between Scope 1, Scope 2 and Scope 3, and I'm going to ignore Scope 1 because it's such a small part of the system. It looks a little bit like this. So if I had a data centre in Sweden where they're using very low carbon intensity electricity, this is going to be your whole life carbon profile for a data centre. So the stuff at the top there, Scope 1 and 2, it's the froth on the top. And at the moment, the data centre industry, if you go into a data centre and you talk to people in the data centre industry, they keep talking about power usage effectiveness. And all they're talking about is reducing the froth on the top. They're not even measuring the Scope 3, the embodied carbon in the servers, in the electronics, in the building. They're not even measuring it. So when I show this to people in the data centre industry, it's quite a surprise to them. Now, the amount of froth you get on the top gets smaller and smaller and smaller, the greener and greener the electricity. So if we went to France, where you're from, and they have a big realisation on this because for decades and decades and decades they've been using nuclear, which is a very low carbon intense form of electricity. And so if you go to OVH in France, they understand this in detail. They absolutely understand it, they've grasped it, they've been doing it for decades. But we can't quite get our head around it. But the point I'm trying to make is where the emissions are, they're in Scope 3. They're in the stuff, the physical stuff. Okay? So, for example, if I went to France and I had an iPhone, and I used this iPhone in France, over the life of using that iPhone, the Scope 3 would be about 80%. The Scope 2, i.e. the plugging it into the electricity grid, would only be 20%. So for an iPhone being used in France, that's the kind of the impact. It's the stuff that's the issue, the embodied carbon emissions in the product. Okay? And just to give you an idea on why it's so bad for electronics, is because when you go into electronics, you get all these precious metals. And one of the precious metals that's in electronics is gold. And if you measured the embodied carbon in producing 1 kilogram of gold, you have to calculate the amount of CO2 emissions just to produce 1 kilogram of gold, you have to multiply that by 28,000. So for every 1 kilogram of gold that you have in the upstream supply, it's 28,000 kilograms of emissions. And we have lots of this. Lots of these precious metals in our IT gear. So it's the IT gear that's the real big kind of issue. Okay? Now, how do we draw down this black stuff? This is the real thing. How do we draw down? We have to dematerialize stuff. So let's give you some examples on how prosumer-driven open source solutions within the OCP Foundation dematerialize the data center and also the electronics. So this is a traditional data center, and in the traditional data center you have the centralized uninterruptible power supplies, the generators, you have all these cooling systems, all these chillers. You have what we call the computer room air conditioning units, then you have the IT racks in the top there. So that's a traditional system. Now, what the kind of hyperscalers said was, this is crazy. We don't want to work this way. So all the hyperscalers work the way I'm going to show you. This is going to be transformed. And I'm basically going to dematerialize this data center. So the first thing you do, you take out all the chillers. Now, just to give you an idea on the chillers, if I was running a data center with all these chillers, it might be 30% of the energy might all be just allocated to this cooling side here within the data center. Directly you start to take those out, you start to really reduce that figure. So directly you start turning off chillers and you just use, say, ambient air, you massively reduce the amount of energy you need. You take out centralized UPS, so you dematerialize that. And then effectively, all you have is the IT space up there. Now what you've actually done, you've dematerialized the whole data center because it's a lot smaller. So all the concrete is less concrete. Now let me dematerialize a rack. This is a faulty server rack and I'm going to dematerialize it. And I'm going to take all these bits out. That was the computer room air conditioning unit. So this is the way an OCP rack works. And compared to a traditional rack, I've taken all this stuff out. In terms of value, capex, cost, to buy, it's somewhere between $10,000 to $16,000 dollars per rack on a 40-server rack configuration. Plus you've dematerialised it. You've actually reduced the weight of this rack by about 18 stone. There's a lot of carbon emissions. Yeah? Now start looking at the server, how we dematerialise the server. This is an OCP server. It looks nothing like your conventional enterprise servers. There's no power supplies in it. There's none of this stuff in it. They're power supply units, no power supplies. No power cords like that. No cases. No graphics elements. No front bezels, which are just branding. No rails. Basically, just take them all out. So this is the dematerialisation at the server level, and it's prosumer driven. It's not driven by vendors, it's driven by prosumers. This is another example of dematerialisation. This is a data centre in Atlanta run by Comcast, and this shows you the before and after from the proprietary on the left, which is 10 racks of gear, plus all that cable, to the open cloud-based solution, which is 1 rack. So basically you take out 10 racks and you put in 1 rack. That's dematerialisation. Now remember all that black stuff? And I said the carbon emissions associated with the data centre are that black stuff, the embodied carbon. Can you see what I've done just by applying prosumer-driven open source technologies? Now, I would argue, why is it not happening? The reason it's not happening is because we don't have enough women in the industry. We have all the technology solutions there, but we don't have enough women. And on the right-hand side here, this is an example. This was a picture of the German Data Center Industry Association with a visit from the Swedish ambassador to Germany, who you can guess she's in the middle. On the left-hand side, we were at COP26, part of Open UK, and this is a group photo of all the heads of state. It's like, fine, where's Wendy? Now, you think, I've always had this instinct that if we don't get women in, we're not going to get these changes. We're not going to get this enthusiasm for this environmental side of the business. And now there's evidence coming forward. There's wonderful papers that you can read now showing what happens when you get women into the management positions in organisations. They impact decarbonisation. Those women there were the new economists. So if I just point out 1 or 2, read all these books if you want to know about the new economic models. All driven by women, not men. This is Donella Meadows. She wrote a book with a team many, many years ago in '72. And if you want to know anything about how to action, the impacts of climate, the way we live, Limits to Growth. Fantastic book. And then watch this. It's a series of lectures about sustainability using systems thinking. And there's one thing that she mentions in this, which is a key ingredient, and it's this. You will never achieve a sustainable system if you haven't got social equity. And in this lecture, she gives an example of why you won't. So social equity is key to the whole of this. And all I say is, I'm introducing you to this wonderful woman. Who knows Vandana Shiva? Who knows her? Go and read her books. Go and read what she says about patents. Go and read what she says about monopoly control. So we need more women in the industry. And luckily, we've got one woman there. We've got a few more women. But we need more women in because they create the change. And there's such good evidence today about the impact when you get women on the boards of businesses. Thank you very much.
You really know how to make women feel special in the data center.
We've also got a woman at the back there as well.
Yes, correct. So, any questions?
That's good, right?
John, I have for the protesters. I have already. For the protesters and those. I think one of the things you were ultimately saying is there's an information disconnect, right? The folks inside the room didn't really know why the protests are upset, and the protesters don't really understand how great everything is that we're doing in the room, right? They don't appreciate necessarily. So is there a way? How do we, in the public, how do we address that kind of?
Well, we need to educate people in both ways. How many people have ever been in a data center? Well, this is unusual. If I was in Civvy Street, so to speak, outside of this area, and I said, what's a data center? They wouldn't even know what it was. And I think what we start to do is create communication, get people into these data centers, and then start conversations. And that's really what we've got to do. And then we'll understand each other's position. But at the moment, you've got groupthink in one side, and you've also got it on the other side. But where I sit, I think what we do in the data center industry is abysmal in terms of its environmental impact.
I'm going to have to counter that, John, because we're working...
Wait, hold on, just use the mic.
Yeah. So we're currently working with the largest data center construction project in Europe down in Portugal, and sustainability is very much embedded into the heart of their thinking. That may be because we're embodied client side, consulting on the sustainability aspects. That and the Infrastructure Masons Climate Accord, Climate Neutral Data Centre Pact, etc. I do think there is a realisation that sustainability is now creeping up the agenda, but it's how you deal with your legacy assets that is the main problem. Most new data centres are fairly sustainable. They are looking at ways to do that. Having said that, we've come across our Portuguese client's consultant was very reluctant to get involved in some of the suggestions that we put forward. And I would agree with you. There is a body of evidence. And I think I know what the problem is, right? It's somebody else's problem field, right? A lot of these people that work at senior level within these organisations are nearing retirement. And this is teaching an old dog a very new trick. And they really don't want to get involved. They just want to see out the last couple of years before retirement, doing what they've always done for the last 30 years, and that is the problem. When they're gone...
John's making a really important point there, and how do we change these cultures? We need to shake things up internally, but the evidence now, if you have a look at the sustainability professionals, and my wife is a sustainability professional, and what I find is 80% of these professionals are women in sustainability. They're not men. They're driving the big changes. We need to get them inside the organisations. We've got Mark there. He's dealing with sustainability professionals because we've set up a sustainability working group within the Open Compute Foundation. And the enthusiasts are women. They're the drivers. They're the people pushing it forward. But that is fundamental to it. And just one thing, if I can show you this. This is a book I recommend you all to read, and it's called The Best of Times, The Worst of Times. And in the end of it, it's a fantastic book about what we should be doing on the climate emergency. And in the end of it, the conclusion is the first element on the conclusion, and I'll kind of read it to you, and it says, we need the continual enfranchisement of women globally. It's women are core to this transformation. So that's my message. Thank you for listening.
One more question.
I have two questions, if you don't mind. My name is Mark Ballard. I'm a freelance journalist. I was wondering, you were saying about you seemed to be implying that you believed it was a problem that in Ireland, people, or in the UK, people had a hosepipe ban, but data centres weren't switched off. I wonder if you would say the same thing about the steel industry and the chemicals industry and the transport industry, the farming industry. I mean, are you saying that the data center industry is just one industry that needs to be switched off when there's a drought, or is it that people are so precious and fragile that they can't do without a hosepipe for the summer when there's a ban?
No, what I'm saying, good point about there's other. I'm talking about the data center industry, but remember,
Yes.
in my model that I showed you, I was talking about a planetary-wide system. But let's just try and focus it on the data center industry. What really makes me angry is this. The technologies that have been used for over 10 years now in some of the data centers that you use for your applications, they use much less resources. They're not dependent on water. You can design data centers without any water usage. And what annoys me is that there's a large... Sorry?
They use more energy when they use less water.
No.
Not necessarily.
No, they don't.
Okay,
No.
okay.
And see, and this is, the technologies are all there, the solutions are all there, all we need to do is change and act and adopt them. For example, if you want to dematerialize, because were you here when I showed the kind of scope 3, most of the black stuff in the emissions? If you start using second user servers or extend the life of a server, you massively reduce. It's not an energy problem, really, when you look at emissions, it's a stuff problem. So just by extending the life of servers, so if you go to France, which I mentioned, OVH, they get up to 13 years out of their servers.
So do you believe that that data centers should be switched off so people can keep their hoses going?
No, what I'm saying is there's an issue with the society who are seeing that the data centers are taking a priority, and that's why you're getting all these demonstrations in Ireland, and you'll start to see them elsewhere. Because there's a disconnect in the data center industry that people don't imply and act on the broader society issues on the sustainability agenda.
Okay. May I ask you one more question?
No, that would be 3. We really are. We're over on this session. Please, we can save them to the...
Yeah. Take it offline.
Yes, please connect him with John offline. Thank you so much, John.
Well, I hope you
done.
Thank you very much.